Okay, all, here is the PowerPoint recording on the lecture regarding the endocrine system, chapter 16 in our textbook that I promised I would give you. So we are going to start with, I'm fooling around with this stupid program. I gotta figure out how to get there. Slideshow, there we go. So we are starting with this really neat picture that represents the plasma membrane. So if you have a look, you can see the phospholipid bilayer. And then we see these big purple blobby things. These are receptors, or receptors for specific chemicals that we're going to talk about in this chapter. And this blue blobby thing represents those specific chemicals. So what we're looking at is the blue blobby thing, which is a hormone molecule. And the purple blobby thing, which is a receptor for that hormone. The only way a hormone is going to affect a cell is if it has a receptor for that hormone. If it does, we call it a target cell. So in this chapter, we are going to look at how these chemicals are carried through the body and affect the way cells do their work. So when we look at the overview of the endocrine system, it talks about the fact that we have organs or bunches of tissue that produce hormones. The hormones are the chemicals in question in this chapter. The tissue that produces the hormones is called endocrine tissue. And the group of these different tissues is called the endocrine system. So there's a little discussion about the comparison of the endocrine system and the nervous system. Both the endocrine system and the nervous system are going to control different systems in the body, cause them to change what they're doing, either speed something up or slow something down. But they do it in a different way. The nervous system, as we discussed in several chapters last semester and this semester, are going to change what cells do by secreting chemicals called neurotransmitters and causing them to speed things up or slow things down or change what they're doing with respect to the chemistry that's going on inside. The endocrine system is going to do the exact same thing, except it's going to do it via chemicals that are secreted by the endocrine tissues and then carry through the circulatory system until they bang into their targets. So this diagram on page 585 in your textbook is an overview of hormone secretion and how it's distributed through the body. We're going to see that there are different types of endocrine tissues and how they function or affect cellular metabolism. We have some that are called endocrine, and when I'm talking about this group and this chapter in particular, I'm talking about glands that produce hormones that then have to travel through the circulatory system and be distributed through the body to cause an effect. So that's kind of the difference with the endocrine system. There are other types of glands called exocrine glands, and those glands typically produce a substance and then secrete it through little tubes or ducts, D-U-C-T-S's, somewhere else. So we just finished talking about special senses, and we talked about the lacrimal glands. And lacrimal glands are exocrine glands that produce tears. So the tissue itself produces the tears, and then they secrete those tears through a duct that wash across the surface of the eye. So that's the difference between an endocrine and an exocrine gland. So we're going to be talking a lot about communicating via the bloodstream in this chapter. So have a peek at the steps here. Hormone is secreted into interstitial fluid. That's fluid between the cells and the circulatory system. They're going to diffuse into capillaries, and they're going to be transported through the system via the circulatory system. Again, they're not going to affect anything unless a cell has a receptor for it. And again, we call that cell a target cell. So this diagram shows us some of the different pathways that these cells can affect their target. So we have endocrine cells that produce a substance that's then transported through blood and comes eventually in contact with a target. Or we can have something called a paracrine cell, and that is a tissue cell that releases these hormones into extracellular fluid that affect cells very close to it or near it. And then we have something called autocrine. And autocrine are specialized cells that secrete hormones into extracellular fluid, and they actually have effect on themselves. So endocrine, paracrine, and autocrine cells are all members of this system. This diagram gives us an overview of some of the different endocrine organs that we're going to discuss in this chapter. Starting at the top, we have a couple of endocrine glands right in central brain regions. The hypothalamus is also part of this chapter because the hypothalamus produces hormones that affect other systems in the body. The pineal gland, which produces a hormone called melatonin, also in these central brain regions, is the wonderful gland that helps to make us sleepy so we can rest in the evening. And then we have the anterior and posterior pituitary gland, which we're going to see in a minute are very busy little glands that control many different systems in the body. Down in the throat region, we have thyroid and parathyroid glands. These are going to help with things like metabolism and calcium absorption. The thymus gland, which sits on top of the heart, is a gland that is going to be very active when we are young. I like to call it T-cell kindergarten because it's where our T cells, and we're going to talk about this when we talk about the immune system, but it's where our T cells go to become immunocompetent. Basically training our cells to recognize our own surface antigen markers. Working our way down, we have the adrenal glands that sit on top of the kidneys. And we're going to talk about groups of hormones that are produced from central adrenal regions called the adrenal medulla and exterior adrenal regions called the adrenal cortex. Pancreas is not going to only come into play when we talk about the digestive system, but it also is going to come into play here in the endocrine system. So it's a versatile little organ that produces hormones as well as digestive enzymes. And then our reproductive organs, both male and female, also produce hormones that are going to have effects on different systems in the body. So these are some of the different endocrine system players that we're going to talk about in this chapter. The next part of the book talks about classes of hormones and how these hormones are going to affect cellular metabolism. We have different classes of hormones based on their chemical makeup. We have some hormones that are lipid-based hormones, and we have some hormones that are water-based hormones. So, on page 587 in your textbook, the classes of hormones are described as the amino acid hormones or the steroid hormones. The steroid are the lipid fat-based hormones. Amino acid are the water-based hormones. One of the things you really need to understand is the physiology of the different hormone classes. I like this diagram because it gives us a visual of how these hydrophilic amino acid-based hormones are actually going to cause an effect within the cell. Our plasma membranes are made of lipids, and lipids are hydrophobic. And this is kind of a refresher from chapter 3 way back when in the first semester. The hydrophilic ends of a phospholipid, and that's these guys that look like little clothespins, face fluid. And then the hydrophobic ends of a phospholipid bilayer kind of hang out together in the middle because they are afraid of water or hydrophobic. If I am a water-based or amino acid-based hormone, I'm going to have a really hard time getting through this wall because of those hydrophobic ends of the phospholipid bilayer. So in order for me to cause an effect on a cell, a target cell, I'm going to have to do it from the outside. Again, I can only a target cell if I have a receptor for that specific hormone. So in this example, we see this little beige or orange receptor and the hormone in question. The hormone comes in contact with the receptor and then sets off a chain of events. And everybody knows that this is a second messenger system-like chain of events. So with a water-based or amino acid-based hormone, these steps are involved in changing what's going on inside the cell. That hydrophobic hormone first has to come in contact with a messenger or a receptor in the plasma membrane. Once it comes in contact, it's going to change shape and it's going to set off a chain reaction within the cell. G proteins are going to then become active and move across the inside of the membrane. They're then going to come in contact with enzymes. In this case, the enzyme in question is called adenylate cyclase. And it's going to, with the help of ATP, convert to cyclic AMP. So adenylate cyclase is the catalase or the enzyme that's going to help the formation of the second messenger in question here, which is called cyclic AMP. So this particular example is an example of the cyclic AMP second messenger system. Once cyclic AMP or CAMP is present within the plasma membrane, it's going to activate proteins. In this case, it's going to activate a protein called protein kinase A. And once protein kinase A has become active, that particular protein is then going to cause changes within the cellular metabolism. In this case, protein kinase A is going to start phosphorylating proteins. It's going to start adding a phosphate to proteins. That's going to change what the cell does. So this is the way that amino acid-based or water-based hormones cause an effect within the cell. The other type of hormone we're going to find is something that is lipid-based hormones. Now these hormones are hydrophobic. They're not water-based hormones, they're lipid-based, or many times described as steroid hormones because steroids belong in the lipid family. These hormones, because they're paisans with the phospholipids, can squeeze their way into the cell quite easily. Their receptor or target receptor is found inside the cell. So these hydrophobic hormones can diffuse into a cell, and then they come in contact with a intracellular receptor. This complex can then enter through the nuclear pores into the nucleus. They then come in contact with a very specific place on our genetic material. Those hormone receptor complexes interact with our DNA directly, and they are going to cause the cell to make different proteins by changing transcription and translation. So they're going to cause the cell to change their proteins directly at the source, the DNA directions. So in short, the difference between water-soluble hormones and lipid-soluble hormones is something you should understand and might be a really good essay question. So the next part of your book talks about some different hormonal interactions, how hormones can work together with other hormones to produce an effect. Or hormones could actually work against other hormones, inhibiting their action. So this little diagram shows us examples of hormonal stimulation with growth hormone releasing hormone, or GHRH, that's going to stimulate the growth from the anterior pituitary cells. Then we see another hormone that's going to actually inhibit the growth, and that's somatostatin. Somatostatin is going to inhibit the secretion of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary gland and slow down the growth of cells. So hormones can act together. Hormones can work against others. There are some hormones that can actually stimulate the release of other hormones. We'll talk about the anterior pituitary gland and some of its players. So, on page 590, it talks about hormone half-life and elimination, and how enzymes can actually break down hormones so they're not circulating through the body constantly. On page 591, this diagram comes into play again when we talk about the regulation of hormone secretion. So some hormones are secreted through what we call humoral stimulus. And that's also the example I gave earlier of growth hormone, releasing hormone, stimulating the secretion of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary cells. We can also have something called humoral stimulation. And this is where I have hormones that are circulating through blood and cause changes in their target cells. And then we can have stimulation from the nervous system to cause cells to release hormones. And a lot of the hormones we're going to talk about when we talk about the adrenal medulla are actually stimulated to be released by the nervous system. So, hormone stimulus, one hormone can stimulate another or prevent a hormone from being secreted. We can have humoral stimulus. And when you think of humoral stimulus, think of humors. And humors was another name for the fluids that floated through our circulatory system way, way back in time. And then we can have neural stimulus. So, in your textbook, on page 591, there's a core principle that refers to feedback loops. And this is an example of a feedback loop that we talked about way, way back when and continue to talk about through these chapters. This is an example of a negative feedback loop when we talk about the endocrine system. So stimulus is going to be regulated by physiological variables and derivatives from its normal range. We have to make sure we have receptors on the endocrine cells that detect those changes and variables. And then we also can get information from control center. So the feedback loop comes into play here. And we have a nice example of a feedback loop that helps maintain homeostasis on page 592 in your textbook. Again, I really like pictures, so I like looking at these diagrams and feedback loops because they just make sense for me. So when something goes lower than it should be, a receptor on the endocrine cells is going to detect that change in variable. We're going to stimulate control centers, and often they are the actual endocrine cells themselves. And I'm going to increase or decrease secretion of a particular hormone. And that hormone is going to trigger a response in the target cells, cause it to do something different, either speed something up or slow something down so that we can get back into homeostatic range. Again, the nervous system does this, and so does the endocrine system. The endocrine system takes a little bit longer because it has to go via the circulatory system to get things done. So the next parts of the chapter are going to go into the specific endocrine players, and they are going to describe the hormones, the tissue itself, the targets that those hormones are after, and the target hormone itself. So what I want you to do for the rest of this chapter, for the rest of chapter 16, is I want you to know where this endocrine gland is. So a little bit about its anatomy. I want you to know what hormones it makes. I want you to know which organs those hormones affect. So the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are discussed beginning on page 593. So the hypothalamus is right above, and you can see it up close and personal here, right above the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland hangs off a little stalk called the infundibulum. And the infundibulum is basically the axons of some cells from the hypothalamus. Right near there we see the optic chiasma, and we discussed that last chapter. Those were the axons from the optic nerve that were bringing information from the back of the retina for processing in the brain. So it's important to understand that the pituitary gland has two parts. It's got a front part and a back part. The anterior pituitary gland and the posterior pituitary gland, or the fancy science name for them, the adenohypophysis or the neurohypophysis. When we look at the hypothalamus, we see there's a lot of neuron-like cells there. Some of these cells produce hormones and then shoot them down this little shaft and store those hormones in the posterior pituitary gland. So the posterior pituitary gland doesn't make anything. It's just a storage box for the hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus. The anterior pituitary gland is actually made of cellular material, and those cells are going to produce a wide variety of hormones that are going to be secreted into the circulatory system and affect many different systems. Because of this, we sometimes refer to the pituitary gland as the master endocrine gland because it controls so many other systems. On page 594, we begin the discussion of the hormones of the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary gland. Remember, the posterior pituitary gland is just a storage place for the hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus. When the body is told it needs some of these hormones, they'll be released from the posterior pituitary gland. First one they talk about is something called antidiuretic hormone. And this is to help with water regulation in the body. You probably have all heard the term diuretic. And a diuretic is given to a patient when they tend to retain too much fluid. It's going to help the patient get rid of excess fluid. So an antidiuretic hormone does the opposite. So the hypothalamic neurons are going to make antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. They're going to travel through that hypothalamus tract in the infundibulum, and then they're going to be stored in the axon terminals in the posterior pituitary gland, or the neurohypophysis. When I need ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and I'm going to use antidiuretic hormone when I need to hold on to fluid. So, for example, I haven't had something to drink in quite some time. I want to hold on to as much fluid as I can. The stimulus for the release of antidiuretic hormone is based on the concentration of dissolved substances in our circulatory system. So when we start to get more concentrated blood floating around in our circulatory system, I'm going to secrete antidiuretic hormone from the posterior pituitary gland so I can hold on to fluid. It's going to have an effect on the kidneys, and we can see that shown to us on page 594. So it's going to affect the kidneys and the filtering system in the kidneys. And when we discuss the renal system, we'll discuss the fact that the kidneys play a huge role in water balance, or osmolality. Remember our talk about tonicity way back when in chapter, I think it was chapter 2 or chapter 3, when we talked about hypotonic, hypertonic, and isotonic solutions. We want our blood to be as isotonic as possible. So the kidneys are going to help make sure that water is balanced through the system. So antidiuretic hormone is going to have an effect on the cells of the filtering system within the kidneys. On page 595, we see the relationship between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary gland. We see those hypothalamic neurons that produce these hormones and how they travel to the posterior pituitary gland. The other hormone that is produced by the hypothalamus is something called oxytocin. That is discussed, they were discussed, they start talking about it on page 596 in your textbook. And oxytocin is going to help with the release of milk in mothers. It's going to have an effect on the brain as well, promoting emotional bonding with mother and child. And it is also going to help with contractions of the uterus in labor. When I look at the feedback loop associated with oxytocin, this particular feedback loop is an example of a positive feedback loop. So in order to stop the release of oxytocin, I have to remove the stimulus. And what was this? Think about what the stimulus is during labor. Stimulus is the stretch of the uterus, and that is due to that growing child inside mother. When the uterus no longer stretches as far as it should, or as far as it does to start the feedback loop releasing oxytocin, I will slow down the release of oxytocin. So that's one of the examples of a positive feedback loop. When I talk about the anterior pituitary gland, this is a different type of gland. So what we see here are actual cells, and these cells make different hormones. The hypothalamus is still going to play a role in the hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary gland by helping to stimulate hormone production. So hypothalamic neurons secrete releasing and inhibiting hormones into the hypothalamic capillary bed. And those hormones are going to travel through veins that will transport or portal into the infundibulum, and then hypothalamic hormones exit the anterior pituitary capillaries and bind to receptors on the anterior pituitary cells. So they're going to stimulate or inhibit, depending on the hormone, the secretion, or depending on the signal, the secretion of hormones from the anterior pituitary cells. These are nice little charts. One begins on page 597. And we see this one described as the multi-tiered negative feedback control of hormones of the hypothalamus, anterior pituitary gland, and target organs. So, they call the pituitary gland the master endocrine gland, but the hypothalamus is the master of the pituitary gland. So, we have different targets for different hormones that are produced and secreted by the anterior pituitary gland. We begin discussion of that on page 596. So the hormones are listed for you, and they go along through page 597. And let me see, anterior pituitary, yep. Yeah, through 597, 598. So some of the hormones that you should know are produced by the anterior pituitary gland. The thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone is going to stimulate the thyroid to produce its hormones. TSH. And thyrotropin releasing hormone and somatostatin. Adrenocorticotropic hormones, or ACTH, are also produced by the anterior pituitary gland. And that's going to help stimulate the development of the adrenal glands and the hormones that they produce. And we're going to talk about the corticotropin hormones. The anterior pituitary gland is going to produce corticotropin releasing hormones. So again, the anterior pituitary gland hormone is going to affect another gland or another system somewhere in the body. Prolactin is another hormone secreted by the anterior pituitary gland. And this is going to help with milk production as well. Luteinizing hormone is another hormone that is going to control another system. It's one of two hormones we are going to describe as the gonadotropins. So luteinizing hormone is going to have effect on reproductive organs in humans. They are going to stimulate the reproductive organ hormones to be released. So luteinizing hormone and gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, are hormones that are produced by the anterior pituitary gland. On the same lines, we have something called follicle stimulating hormone. And follicle stimulating hormone is also going to have an effect on the reproductive organs. It's going to help with the release of reproductive cells in females and in males. FSH is going to work with LH, follicle stimulating, with luteinizing hormone to trigger the production of estrogens, and basically going to help mature reproductive cells in the reproductive system. This is an example or a diagram we see showing the effects of growth hormone, which is also produced by the anterior pituitary gland. On page 598, we see a description. So growth hormone is going to have an effect on cellular metabolism. It's going to have an effect on how the cell utilizes energy and causes growth of different cells within the system. Some of the short-term effects described on the left-hand side is going to has to do with the use of glucose in cellular metabolism and the use of lipid for energy in cellular metabolism. And then long-term effects are going to affect things like blood glucose concentrations, bone growth, muscle mass. So growth hormone is an important hormone for the growth and maintenance of cells in general. Insulin-like growth factors are described in the textbook as well, and they are going to again have an effect on cellular metabolism within the cells, affecting growth rate of cells. On page 599, they talk about some growth hormone disorders. So imbalances in these hormone secretions can disrupt cell growth in general. They can cause cells to grow too quickly or not quickly enough. There's a little AP in the real world describing human growth hormone and the fountain of youth and some of the risks associated with taking human growth hormone. They talk about giantism and acromegaly, and then the hyposecretion of growth hormone or not enough growth hormone, which can result in dwarfism. So this diagram here is an example of the feedback loop associated with the regulation of growth hormone release. So, love our book. There's a nice table, 16.1 on page 600. So this is the table that's going to help you kind of make everything small. You know how I always say make everything small when you go to study. So these are the hormones of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Remember, the hypothalamus makes antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. The pituitary gland, only the anterior pituitary gland makes hormones. The posterior pituitary gland stores hormones. So, this chart will narrow everything down for you. Know this chart. The next gland they're going to talk about in this book is the thyroid and parathyroid gland. So in your neck, these guys hang out around your larynx, your Adam's apple. That's where your thyroid is at. And when we look at the thyroid gland, we see cells called follicular cells. And then in the center, it looks like there's nothing there. Well, there's something really important there. I like to call that my thyroid hormone soup, because the cells, the parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland, produce the hormones. And then they put them in kind of almost unfinished form into this colloid or thyroid soup to wait until they're called for. When they're called for, they're going to pull some of these out, finish their production, chop them up to exactly where they should be, and throw them into the circulatory system to then circulate through the body. So when I look at the thyroid gland under the microscope, it's very distinct. I see those cells in a circle, and then I see this big pink colloid. Again, in the neck, we find these groups of cells and the cells that produce the colloid. The parathyroid glands are little dots of tissue that sit on the thyroid gland. So we're going to talk about them both. Structure of the thyroid and parathyroid glands show us those thyroid follicles, those colloids, and the parafollicular cells. This is an up-close personal of those parafollicular cells. So this cell and this circulatory system on the cell, capillaries, are where we're going to get all of the ingredients for making thyroid hormone. Some of the important ingredients to make thyroid hormone are shown here. Iodine is one of those important ingredients. So iodide ions in the circulatory system are an important ingredient for making thyroid hormone. I'm going to take them out of the circulatory system, and the follicular cells are going to throw them into the colloid. Iodide ions are converted to iodine ions, and that's what we're going to use to make our thyroid hormone. The other important molecule that I'm going to need to make thyroid hormones is something called thyroglobulin. I'm going to produce thyroglobulin in the follicular cells. And it's in this diagram, it's this little blue squiggly what's this. So I make thyroglobulin, I package it up, and I push it out through exocytosis into the colloid. When I need thyroid hormones in their intact form, and the shortened name for them is T3 and T4. T3 is triiodothyronine, and we see that description on page 603. I'm going to assemble the thyroglobulin and the iodine. And that's going to happen by creating a little pocket with all of the ingredients I need. And while that pocket I create through endocytosis is making its travel to the opposite end of the cell now, from the colloid to the circulatory system, I am going to, with the help of some enzymes, cut that molecule that I created in the colloid, and these MITs and DITs are examples of that molecule. I'm going to cut them up just right. I'm going to cut them up into T3 and T4. And then I'm going to release them into the circulatory system, where they're going to cause an effect on different cellular metabolism. So they're going to regulate metabolic rate, they're going to regulate temperature, they're going to promote growth and development, they're going to work as synergists with the sympathetic nervous system, and those effects are described on page 602 in your textbook under the effects of thyroid hormones. So thyroglobulin complexes, iodine, the iodination of thyroglobulin, and then the release of T3 and T4 are described in steps 1, 2, 3, and 4 on page 603 in your textbooks. And then this is a nice little diagram. Again, I'm a diagram person, so I like diagrams. Yes? That might make a nice essay question. So the regulation of thyroid production, thyroid hormone production, and thyroid disorders are discussed on page 604 in your textbook. Again, anterior pituitary gland is going to play a role here because it produces thyroid stimulating hormone. That's going to get us going to get some ingredients from that colloid and chop it up and then send it out as T3 and T4. They discuss hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism on page 604 and 605. Common causes of hyperthyroidism is something called Graves' disease, which is an autoimmune disorder. And that can cause abnormal proteins that mimic actions of TSH on the thyroid, causing it to overproduce T3 and T4. Disorders of the thyroid secretion in a goiter can be seen in an image on page 605. So the first signal of hyperthyroidism is an enlargement of the thyroid gland. This is a long time hypersecretion of thyroid in this goiter that you can see in this image. Changes in metabolism are the bottom line. So speeding up, slowing down. So some patients with hypothyroidism can also suffer from obesity as a result. So need figure 16.16 showing us the relationship between the anterior pituitary gland and the secretion of T3 and T4 from the thyroid. Feedback mechanisms, yes? So understanding the feedback loop, maintaining homeostasis, regulation of calcium ions can be seen here on page 607, figure 16.18. So starting on page 606, there's a discussion of the parathyroid hormones and another hormone that the thyroid produces called calcitonin. So the hormone that the parathyroid hormones produces is called parathyroid hormone. And parathyroid hormone is going to play a role in helping to maintain blood calcium levels. So parathyroid hormone is going to be secreted in response to a decrease in blood calcium concentration. Now, I don't know if you remember when we discussed bones, but when we discussed bones, we talked about the fact that bones are a storage place for minerals like calcium and phosphorus and magnesium. When calcium levels in the circulatory system go down, I'm going to tap that storage. So parathyroid hormone is going to be released when calcium ion levels go down in blood, and they are going to stimulate the osteoclasts to start degrading that bone matrix, those outer rings, the circumferential lamellae that we talked about when we talked about bone. So that is going to break down that matrix and cause it to be released into the circulatory system. Now, many hormones play double duty. So not only does parathyroid hormone have an effect on osteoclasts, but it's also going to have an effect on the kidneys. Because if I need to increase calcium levels, I want to increase or reabsorb more calcium from my filtering system in the kidneys instead of secreting excess calcium into urine. Kidneys activate something called calcitriol, and that's going to also increase calcium absorption in the small intestine. So 3 different systems that parathyroid hormone is going to affect. So remember, decrease calcium levels, parathyroid hormone is released to help increase calcium levels. The other hormone that's going to play a role in regulating calcium levels is something called calcitonin. And calcitonin is secreted by the thyroid gland. And calcitonin is going to have an effect on parathyroid hormone by decreasing its secretion. So when I have lots of calcium in my circulatory system, say I went to Fielder's Choice and maybe had a really big ice cream, I want to be able to take that extra calcium from the circulatory system and store it in bone matrix. So calcitonin is going to have an effect on calcium when I have lots of calcium that I want to take out of the circulatory system and store in bone matrix. So it's going to help my cells, or my osteoblasts, store that extra calcium in bone matrix. Again, love my book, because on page 607 we see the hormones of the thyroid and parathyroid gland chart. Triiodothyronine, T3, and thyroxine, T4, are produced by the follicular cells of the thyroid. The parafollicular cells are going to produce calcitonin, and we see the effects here in the chart. Parathyroid glands produce parathyroid hormone, and we see the effects to help with calcium regulation. So the two are going to work hand in hand for calcium regulation. The next gland is the adrenal glands. And in the adrenal glands, we're going to see 2 parts to my adrenal gland. We're going to see the outer capsule, which we call the adrenal cortex. And we're going to see the middle region, which we call the adrenal medulla. So the capsule and the layers of different cells here in the adrenal cortex are going to produce several different types of hormones. At the bottom of this picture, we see the cells of the adrenal medulla. Again, I'm going to cut to the chase and refer to this table. So the adrenal cortical hormones, the cortex, the zona, are aldosterone, cortisol, and a group of hormones called androgens. The adrenal medullary hormones produced by the adrenal medulla are what we call catecholamines. You may have heard of some of these: epinephrine and norepinephrine. Adrenal corticotropic hormones. And these are some of their effects. So now I'm going to go back. So some of the things that we're going to see affected by this group of hormones are absorption of ions, sodium and chloride, in the kidneys. We're going to affect water absorption. We're going to talk about this in a lot more detail when we talk about the renal system. But we're going to see how these hormones, aldosterone, is going to help regulate the extracellular fluid volume. So when we talk about fluid and electrolytes, we're going to talk about aldosterone and its effect on the kidneys. It's going to also affect, because of water balance, blood pressure and acid-base balance. The glucocorticoids are going to be discussed on page 610, and how they help to affect metabolic homeostasis. So when we talk about cellular respiration and we talk about the energy molecules involved in reactions of metabolism to produce ATP, we are going to talk about these guys again. So they are going to have an effect. Cortisol, in particular, is described on page 610, on the type of molecule I use to make my ATP. Glucose is ideal, but I can also use fatty acids from fat, and I can use amino acids from protein as well. So we see a description on page 610 talking about the effects of cortisol in gluconeogenesis in the liver, the release of amino acids from muscle tissue, the breakdown of protein, and the release of fatty acids from adipose tissue. And this diagram sort of shows where those molecules are then going to go with the help of the adrenal cortex and cortisol. So I can use all of these guys to make my ATP. Unfortunately, sometimes release of too many hormones can cause issues. And Cushing's disease is described in your book under homeostatic imbalances of cortisol production. So we see the description of Cushing's disease on page 612 in your textbook. And that can cause problems with lipid production and storage. On page 614, we see the next of our players in the endocrine system, the pancreas. Now, the pancreas does double duty. It's an endocrine and an exocrine gland. In the case of the endocrine system, it's going to produce hormones that are going to help regulate the utilization of glucose. So when we talk about its endocrine job, we are going to talk about the alpha cells, the beta cells, and the delta cells. And we find these in areas in the pancreas called the pancreatic islets. Back in the day, they used to call them the islets of Langerhans, because some German guy probably was the one to discover these. So the hormones that we are going to discuss in the islets and their production are glucagon, insulin, and hormones that are very similar to the somatostatins that are produced by the hypothalamus. So the alpha cells, and you can see them in this diagram, the cute little blue ones in the islets of Langerhans, make a hormone called glucagon. And glucagon, we begin the description on page 615, is a hormone that is going to help me increase blood glucose levels when they start to go down. It's going to do that by breaking down stored glucose from the last time I went to Fielder's Choice. When I went to Fielder's Choice, not only did I get some wonderful calcium in my ice cream, but I also got some nice sugar in my ice cream. So the excess of that sugar, I'm going to do a couple things with it. First thing I'm going to do, use it to make energy. Well, if I don't need all of it, I'm going to save some for a rainy day. And I'm going to save it in two places. In one place, I'm going to take quickly some of that glucose and create glycogen molecules. And I'm going to store those in places like liver and muscle cells. Glycogen are just big, huge glucose molecules all stuck together. Glucagon will break them down and release them into the circulatory system when blood glucose levels go down. The formation of new glucose by gluconeogenesis in the liver is what this is going to stimulate. And we'll talk about these when we talk about cellular respiration and all that good stuff. But glucagon, secreted by the alpha cells, are going to help break down glycogen to increase blood glucose. Now, when I ate the ice cream at Fielder's Choice and had all that glucose in my body, I needed to somehow get it out of the circulatory system and bring it into the cells to either use it for cellular metabolism or make the glycogen, or if I have way too much glucose, I'm going to make fat with it. So the next hormone produced by the beta cells in the islets of Langerhans, and if I look at the diagram, the beta cells are the purple cells in the picture, is something called insulin. And the purpose of insulin is to take glucose from the circulatory system and suck it into the cells, so the cells can use it to do all of their goodies. So described on page 616 is insulin and what it does. Insulin has another role. When insulin levels get too high too fast, it can also cause me to take all of that excess glucose and make fat with it, lipogenesis. So again, a lot of times we'll see double duty for a lot of these different hormones. Problems with secretion of insulin can result in problems with regulating blood glucose levels. So that's talked about under type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So we'll talk about that in class. Blood glucose regulation then is kind of a hand-in-hand between glycogen breakdown and glucagon hormones and insulin hormone and utilization of glucose. So on page 617, we see a blurb about glucose regulation. Feedback mechanisms, again, help us understand how these guys work. So we see the response by insulin to high blood glucose concentrations, and we see the response by glucagon to low blood glucose concentrations. Again, an awesome table. Oh, awesome table on page 612 in your textbook is going to talk about some of these different hormones. So what I'm going to do in lecture is pick up with the others, talk about those, and then we can review in class the anterior posterior pituitary gland. We can review the thyroid gland. We can review the parathyroid gland, the pancreas, so on and so forth. So hopefully this will get you started thinking in terms of what I want you to know for the endocrine system chapter. I will see you all in class on Monday so we can finish up the endocrine system chapter together. I hope you all have a great weekend.